Made them look is not quite accurate, and the inaccuracy matters. You did not make them look immature. You simply were mature in the specific, constitutionally genuine, internally developed way of someone who has done the work of becoming the full, grounded, self-possessed version of yourself, and the maturity, in contrast with the avoidance behavior, made the immaturity visible. The visibility is not your doing. It is the natural consequence of genuine maturity existing in proximity to behavior that is governed by fear rather than by the developed, adult, self-aware capacity for genuine connection. The embarrassment is real, and it is the specific, particular, not ordinary social embarrassment quality of something that reaches the avoidance interior at the level of identity rather than at the level of social presentation. Not the embarrassment of someone who said something awkward in public. The embarrassment of someone who has just seen, with a clarity that their management system's usual function was preventing them from seeing, the gap between who they are presenting themselves as being and who they actually demonstrated themselves to be in the specific, concrete, witnessed context of how they behaved in relation to you. The immaturity is not intellectual. This needs to be established clearly because the avoidant is often, in the intellectual domains of their life, quite sophisticated. The thinking is developed, the analysis is capable, the engagement with ideas can be genuinely, impressively mature. The avoidant has often developed intellectual sophistication precisely because the intellectual domain is one where the management system does not need to run. Ideas do not generate intimacy pressure the way people do, and so the engagement with ideas can be full and unguarded in a way that the engagement with people cannot. The immaturity is emotional and relational. The specific, developmental, never fully progressed past immaturity of someone whose emotional responses to closeness are still governed by the same self-protective mechanisms that were installed in childhood, mechanisms that were age-appropriate for the child who needed them and that have not been updated or not sufficiently updated for the adult who is now using them in contexts that the mechanisms were not designed for and that the mechanisms are, by being deployed in those contexts, actively damaging. The emotional immaturity presents as the withdrawal that happens when things get real, the distance that is created when genuine closeness reaches the threshold, the inability to sustain the full emotional presence that genuine adult relationship requires, the management of feelings rather than the feeling of feelings, the self-protective maneuvers that make the avoidant in the relational domain look and function like someone who has not yet developed the adult emotional capacity that their chronological age and their intellectual sophistication suggest should be present. This is what you made visible, not through any action directed at the visibility. Through being in the same relational context, the version of yourself that has developed the emotional maturity, the avoidant, has not yet fully developed. The specific ways in which your maturity made the avoidance immaturity visible are worth examining in detail because each one is a different facet of the same basic contrast. The contrast between someone who is governing their relational behavior from a developed, adult, genuinely self-aware place and someone who is governing their relational behavior from the child's self-protective mechanisms that were never adequately updated. The first way is how you handle difficult conversations. The mature person can be in a difficult conversation, can hear something challenging about their behavior, can hold the discomfort of genuine accountability, can stay in the room with another person's hurt without the urgency to exit or to deflect or to reframe the conversation in a way that makes the difficulty smaller or more manageable. The avoidance response to difficult conversations is characteristically immature, not in the sense of childish, but in the developmental sense of someone who has not yet built the specific emotional capacity that difficult conversations require, the deflection, the minimizing, the sudden need for distance, the reframing of the conversation away from the content that is most uncomfortable. Your ability to stay in the conversation, to hold the difficulty without fleeing it, to keep the content of what was difficult in view without the management's function replacing it with something more comfortable was the maturity. The contrast with the avoidance response to the same conversation was the embarrassment source, because the contrast made visible in the specific, concrete, undeniable way of direct comparison in the same context, the difference between developed relational capacity and undeveloped relational capacity. The second way is how you express needs. The mature expression of need is direct, specific, and unentangled from the expected response. You have a need. You express it. The expression is honest and clear and does not require a particular response to be a legitimate expression. The need exists independently of whether it is met. The expression of it does not collapse into the dynamics of whether the expression produces the desired response or not. The need is expressed. What happens next is what happens next. The maturity is in the ability to separate the expression from the outcome, to need and to say so, and to remain yourself, regardless of whether the saying produces the meeting. The avoidance relationship with need is immature in the developmental sense, governed by the childhood learning that needing produces responses that make the needing more costly than the suppressing. The avoidant either suppresses the need entirely or expresses it in indirect, ambiguous, plausibly deniable forms that protect the avoidant from the full exposure of the direct expression, the need that is never quite said directly, the wanting that is communicated through behavior rather than through language, the vulnerability that is approached and then retreated from at the last moment before the full exposure. Your direct, unentangled, outcome-independent expression of needs was the maturity. The avoidance comparison of their own inability to do this with your ease in doing it was the embarrassment. Because the comparison revealed the specific developmental gap between where you are in the emotional growth process and where the avoidant, for all their intellectual sophistication, remains. The third way, and the one that produces the most specifically acute embarrassment, is how you responded to the avoidance behavior. The avoidance behavior across the connection included the various management-produced outputs that the pattern generates: the withdrawals, the inconsistencies, the insufficient meetings, the moments of emotional unavailability, the specific ways in which the fear governed the behavior rather than the adult, genuinely choosing, taking responsibility for the impact person. The avoidant presents themselves as being in the intellectual and professional domains of their life. You responded to this behavior with the maturity of someone who sees it clearly, acknowledges its impact honestly, and does not pretend it is something other than what it is, while simultaneously not being destabilized by it at the foundational level. You did not perform acceptance, did not pretend the behavior was acceptable, did not absorb it silently, and make yourself smaller to accommodate it. You saw it, named it with the composed, non-emotional directness of someone who has a genuine relationship with their own perception, and remained yourself. This response, clear-eyed, composed, not destabilized, not retaliating, is the most developed relational response available. It is the response of someone who has integrated their emotional experience to the degree that the emotions are informative rather than governing, who can feel the impact of the avoidance behavior and speak from the feeling without the feeling becoming the entire content of the response. The avoidant, watching this response, saw something they did not expect. Not the hurt they had unconsciously anticipated, not the accommodation they had been counting on, not the emotional flooding that would have made the avoidance management's function feel, comparatively, like the mature and composed response. The specific, settled, composed, non-retaliating clarity of someone whose emotional development exceeds what the avoidance behavior was calibrated against. The immaturity was made visible by the contrast, and the contrast produced the embarrassment. The embarrassment is not comfortable for the avoidant, but it is significant, because the specific, identity-level embarrassment of someone who has just seen the gap between their intellectual self-concept, the sophisticated, capable, self-aware adult they present themselves as being, and their relational reality, the fear-governed, self-protective, emotionally immature behavior they actually produced in the connection, is one of the more powerful motivators for genuine internal examination. Not guaranteed. The embarrassment can be managed, like everything else, into a narrative that reduces its impact on the self-concept without producing the genuine examination it was calling for. The avoidant is sophisticated enough to construct the narrative that makes the embarrassment about something other than the gap it actually revealed. But the embarrassment is also, in the cases where the genuine examination follows, the beginning of the most important question the avoidance relational life can produce. Not the question of why you behaved the way you behaved, the question of why I behaved the way I behaved, what it means about where I actually am in the developmental process I thought I had further progressed through, what it would take to develop the capacity that the contrast with you made clear I do not yet have. That question, asked genuinely and pursued honestly, is the beginning of the healing piece's description, the beginning of the work, the beginning of the possibility of becoming someone whose relational behavior matches the intellectual self-concept that the avoidance presentation has always claimed. You did not make them look immature. You were mature in the genuine, internally developed, nothing to do with making them look anything way of someone who has done the work. The immaturity was there before you arrived. You simply brought the maturity that made it visible, not as a judgment, not as a performance of superiority, as the natural, inevitable, entirely non-strategic consequence of two people being in the same relational context at genuinely different levels of emotional development, and the difference being exactly as visible as differences at that level always are when the light is honest enough to see them clearly. The embarrassment is their reckoning with the visibility. The maturity is yours to keep, not as evidence of being better than the avoidant, but as evidence of how far the work has already brought you, and how much further it will take you from here.